Well, we're going to change the agenda up a little bit. I've got to just step out for a moment. Vice Chair Belknap uh, will be chairing. I think we're going to jump over 5 and 6. We'll come back to them. So we'll probably go to 7. Is that what you want to do, Vice Chair? Okay.
Yes, please. So
I shall return.
Scott, we're going to go to number 7 on our agenda, and everyone else to monthly budget report. If you want to do each one, 7, 1, 2, and 3.
Yes, thanks, Chair Belknap. Deputy Superintendent of Operations Scott Jones. This is the monthly budget report for this board meeting, February 2021. As of this date, the Utah State Board of Education is fiscally sound to meet all of its expected obligations and commitments. We do provide in the backup a detailed breakdown of the budgets by section across the entire Utah State Board of Education organization. That includes both funding that stays internally to the board and the flow through dollars. Chair Belknap, pending any questions or concerns from board members, this is item number 1, or 7.1.
I don't see any hands up, but Deputy Superintendent Jones, I do have one question. Can you tell me how, usually at this time of year, we're about halfway done with most of our spending. How has this year been any different because of COVID, or is there a different curve?
Okay. Yes, great question, ma'am. So one of the biggest impacts I would say is obviously to our prior years, a lot of group gatherings, a lot of travel that's taken place. So definitely impacted that, meaning less, right? Less of in-house meetings, less of our employees traveling, much more of the virtual environment, participation in, and that's not to say that trainings aren't happening. And I'm not saying that, we're not still monitoring or doing all of the requirements out there. It's just different. It's a different process we take to make sure that we are meeting the requirements of, such things as monitoring and training and things like that. So we're anticipating, I think this is probably along the lines of your question too. We're anticipating some carry forward balances, at the end of the year. And then, we go through the process of realigning those and, respectfully requesting the allocation of those dollars in tandem with what is the Money Management Act and Budgetary Procedures Act. Did I answer your question, Chair Belknap?
Yes, thank you. I don't see any other questions. You can go on to 7.2.
Okay, if someone would pull up the discretionary funds report, please. Each month, staff put together or provide for your review and inclusion and public display, if you will, both the monthly budget report and what we call your discretionary funds report. Discretionary funds are typically made up of what I just mentioned in the context of Chair Belknap's question regarding carry forward dollars, or dollars that we didn't quite get to expend, for a variety of reasons, one of which this year obviously would be impacted significantly by COVID. But these are broken out by the types of funds. I'm orienting board members to the upper and the public to the upper right-hand corner of the discretionary funds report. So we started out with particular balances last year, at the end of last year, and by virtue of the process that I briefly described, where you as the board make determinations of the uses of the discretionary funds across state funds, general funds. FML stands for federal mineral lease dollars, land exchange, and there's that dedicated credits that board member Cannon brought up when we had the USDB. So I appreciate the explanation behind those. Then if you orient you to the left-hand side of the chart, these are projects that you as the board, list of projects that you as the board have approved in the past for use of the funds. And then moving left to right, there are no pending requests. And then we break it down by which fund source you approved, starting with the approved state funds. And those 16, 17, 18, 19 are the fiscal years of those balances that were brought forward or into this discretionary account. And then the account of the codes we use, the budget codes we use appropriately. Then your approved general funds, your approval of your federal mineral lease fund, approved land exchange, again, broken down or across the individual or particular projects that you've approved in the past. And then to the furthest right, we always try to provide notes, try to make sure we, from a historical perspective, we're audited when you approve that in the notes section, or, status of obligations, things like that. And then just the column to the left of the notes column is what the remaining balance is, or what's still not been expended to date, which is, the expenditure rate is in that third to the last column. So subject to any questions or concerns with the discretionary funds report, this concludes item 7.2. So.
Thank you. We have a question by Board Member Lear.
Okay.
Thank you. Scott, can you tell me what happens to the discretionary funds that remain unused at the end of the year? Do they roll over to the next year? Or are they reclaimed by someone? What happens?
Yeah, well, and I really appreciate that question, because as I was talking, I was thinking about, I really need to make sure that I'm clear that while there might be carry forward balances, some of those balances are specific to a program. So even if we have additional balances in there, they still have to stay in that program. What you see here is unrestricted funds, or unencumbered and unrestricted funds. And to answer your question, they are non-lapsing. It means we don't have to return them back to the legislature. They can roll into the next year. And then, by virtue of what I just tried to describe, we make sure that we're clear with you and the public on, what those balances are and whether they need to remain specific to that program, or if we can roll them into a discretionary fund because they meet that criteria of being unrestricted, non-lapsing balances. Through the chair, did I answer Board Member Lear's question?
Thank you. Yes, you did.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands, Scott. So if you want to go on to 7.3.
Chair, at this time, I'd ask that you recognize Director Sarah Young for 7.3.
Miss Sarah.
Thank you, Deputy Jones and Vice Chair Belknap. Sarah Young, Director of Strategic Initiatives. Jerry, would it be possible to share my screen? While I'm working on that, I'm here today to provide you your monthly update related to CARES funding for K-12. As we are working to get my slides up on the screen, I will share a recent update that happened after board backup was due. We have had the opportunity to be able to complete our first year of federal reporting for both Esser as well as GEAR. That was submitted to the U.S. Department of Education on Monday, and we completed that task as a state. Great, let me bring my slides up. Okay. So this information is as of January 26, 2021. Just a friendly reminder, when we talk about the K-12 CARES funding for Utah, we are looking at a broad variety of individual funding streams and awards. That includes Esser and GEAR, as well as coronavirus relief awards that were given to K-12 by the state of Utah in late fall of 2020. And those are broken up into sub-uses as approved by the state legislature.
Sarah, will you go over what GEARS and Esser stand for, please?
Yes, so Esser stands for the Elementary and Secondary Schools Emergency Relief Act, or Esser. GEAR is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Award. So that particular award could have been granted to K-16 in the state of Utah for the first round. At the time, Governor Herbert awarded it specifically to K-12. Today, we're also going to introduce two new awards that are as a result of the December actions by the federal government to provide additional stimulus funding. So let's start off with the traditional awards. We're sharing this table to be able to show those existing awards from the original CARES Act, as well as the amount that has been reimbursed and how that compares in terms of percentage. You'll note that we do have some of our awards that are kind of reaching near or closer to that fully reimbursed space. Those are going to be most of the awards in green, and we highlight those because those are using state coronavirus relief funds, which our schools have until June 30th of 2021 or the end of this fiscal year to be able to spend. So it would make sense that those expenditures are prioritized and are going to happen sooner than the ESSER or original GEAR funds, in which they have more time to be able to spend. For Esser 2, so Esser 2, so much fun. Esser 2 has been a new distribution that was again awarded to Utah as part of the Coronavirus Relief Act that was passed in December of 2020. Just to be clear, this follows the same funding mechanisms that the original Esser did, where about 90% of it is funded based on the Title I formula distribution direct to the LEAs. So 90% of the total award, which is a little over $274 million, flows through direct to our LEAs upon application. I will note that these awards are slightly more than 4 times the amount they received in their ESSER 1 awards. Thus allowing the state base, which we provide to LEAs that would not receive funds or would receive reduced funds under their Title I allowance, for the new base to be $84,777 per LEA. These will be available for obligation by our state and subrecipients through September 30th of 2023. And their uses are the same as ESSER 1. I will note that the new legislation did call out some specific use cases, such as addressing learning loss, preparing schools for reopening, testing, repairing and upgrading projects to include air quality in school buildings. Although those use cases were specifically called out related to this new award, it is noted that those were also allowable under the previous CARES funding. In terms of the Esser timeline, this has changed, but we wanted to share with you what it was prior to last week. So originally the plan was that the state had received our Esser Award letter from the U.S. Department of Education on January 6th. We did release the grant opportunity in the Utah Grants Management System to our individual LEAs on January the 19th. And we had asked them to be due to our office as soon as possible, noting that they would have until February 5th, 2021 to be able to apply. As a part of that, Sarah Harward, who is our CARES Administrative Secretary, went through and did a division of what those plans as submitted by backup were kind of broken down to against the federal allowable categories. So a couple things that I would note about this: you're going to have LEA plans that are going to touch on multiple categories. So when you add up the total numbers that are represented across categories, they're not going to be exactly equal to the number of LEAs. They're just going to represent the number of times a category was referenced in an individual plan that had been submitted. You'll see that some of our larger categories in the initial application were Category 9, which is our educational technology space, as well as Category 12, which was one of the newer categories called out around addressing learning loss. You can see kind of the breakdown in where we had categorized the existing plans. After those plans were submitted, there was a release of intent language in Senate Bill 1 for substitute, which is the base budget. So our state legislators included language in the adoption and allocation of this award, and I've provided it on the screen. To summarize, it basically states that the Utah State Board of Education should direct LEAs to focus these funds on specifically learning loss. And they provided some exemplars of what they saw as use cases that aligned explicitly with that learning loss. The item I'd like to note is really at the lower part of the screen, and it starts on line 426. And this is where it states that if a local education agency opted to use these funds for a purpose other than what was described above, that it would be the responsibility of the State Board of Education to reduce that local agency's allocation under the minimum school program for $1 for every dollar that was spent outside of these state identified use cases. So this was a surprise to our LEAs who had already submitted their plans, and definitely caused some turmoil within the larger education community. Your staff decided that it was best to pause, and ultimately we will move forward with reissuing Esser 2 with these guidelines. It was important for us to make sure that all of our local education agencies have transparency on this new state language and use that to ultimately inform their plans. In addition to that, we are going to be asking the LEAs to directly align their use cases with learning loss to make sure that we are meeting this particular piece of code. An LEA also has the opportunity to claim that they are going to use it for other use cases and that they understand the impact to their individual MSP. So the last thing I just wanted to touch on, or second to last, is that the additional Coronavirus Relief Act does have 2 additional awards aside from Esser 2 that we will be bringing to you in the future. The first one is Gear 2. So this is the second round of the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. Currently, we are working with representatives from the Governor's Office as well as Governor's Office of Management and Budget to look at existing needs within the community and decide how this fund would be best to support individual community needs across K-16. The second item is also new and unique to federal programs. It is the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools. So in the prior CARES awards for both Esser as well as GEAR, for our districts that accepted those awards, they were required to provide equitable services to our private schools. That is basically a recognition that those private schools are going to have impacts related to COVID as well. And they go through a process with which to work together to be able to make sure that needs are met for all K-12 children. Instead of asking for equitable services in this new act, the U.S. Department of Education has established a completely new program, which is now the EANS or EANS Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools. This is an award that will be accepted by the governor of the state of Utah. We expect that certification request to go in this Friday, February the 5th, and then USBE as the SEA would be responsible for the administration of this program. We are working collaboratively with the governor's office on designing draft applications, and we have reached out to our private school partners to set up a preview of the program to get feedback from them before we would officially launch next week. Last but not least, so you had tasked staff with the administration of the CARES survey. This included our federal reporting requirements, which we did submit on Monday. Additionally, it contained questions specific to Utah legislative requests, which was presented in Public Ed Appropriations on January 22nd, 2021 by Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley. And then last but not least, the survey did include inquiries from the Utah State Board of Education, and that will be presented a little later today by Dr. Jill Curry. That concludes my update on CARES. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sarah, oh wait, I do see a hand. Vice Chair Davis.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, on the new fund, on the emergency assistance for new public schools, I mean, what is our responsibility? Only disbursement? Is it oversight? Is the money subject to the guidelines that the public schools money is subject to? And is this money subject to the restricted guidelines that our state is has set up in is it SR1? I don't remember the name.
Thank you, Board Member Davis. No, great questions. So this particular program has its own specific legislation that will call out its allowable use cases. The U.S. Department of Education has an entire website that's dedicated to this new program. They've also provided a sample application as well as a frequently asked questions about what is allowable and what is not. Because federal funds have to be maintained and in control of a public institution, this program is very unique. It does allow for reimbursement of previous expenses that are in alignment with the eligible use cases. There are some specific restrictions around entities that received a PPP grant after on or after December the 27th of 2020 when the legislation passed. So we're working through kind of all of those specifics. The role of the Utah State Board of Education will be in the administration of the award, as well as running the application cycle, which will include the reimbursement components, as well as potentially the provision of services and materials in alignment with the allowable use cases.
Vice Chair Davis, are you okay with that?
Yeah, just so I understand. So the oversight is actually in the disbursement because we're following the guidelines for the reimbursed allowable cost. I just wasn't sure, do those guidelines, are they similar to the ones, the allowable uses for the public schools? And is there any other kind of additional restriction, or is it quite different?
They are similar. I will say that they do call out some explicit services as not allowable that are allowable underneath Esser 2 and CARES. And so their list does have, I would say, quite a bit of overlap, but not necessarily like a kind of line by line alignment. As far as the state intent language goes, that is very specific to Esser 2 as the only award that has been accepted. The EANS award has not been addressed by our state legislature yet, so it will remain to be seen if they take action related to this in a similar fashion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So the GEARS money, has there already been conversation and how do you see that flowing where GEARS fully came to public K-12 education rather than the K-16? What do you know?
Yes, so great question. So we have weekly meetings with the governor's office as well as with LFA to discuss and coordinate on CARES. In our latest meeting, when it came to Gear 2, it was discussed that all decisions related to the allocation of Gear 2 and the intended use cases would most likely be delayed until the end of legislative session. I think the intent of all leaders involved in that conversation was that we recognize that there is potential for some of those needs to be addressed by state resources, and it may be valuable to wait until we have outcomes in that space before then allocating and looking at needs related to the Gear 2 funds. So that's the current plan for Gear 2, but the governor's office could clearly change their mind.
Okay, and second, Sarah, because GEARS comes from the governor's office, it would not have stipulations put on it by legislature, but the governor could.
So in our previous issuing of Gear 1, we collaborated with the governor's office on identifying the most significantly impacted LEAs. That was a requirement of that specific award in terms of federal guidance. And then in addition to then identifying most significantly impacted LEAs, the distribution calculation was completed by the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. And then we collaborated again on an application for LEAs, which specifically targeted special education needs as well as students at risk of academic failure. So those were the two kind of use cases for Gear 1. It is not clear what, and nor has it been defined, what these specific use cases will be for year 2 in regards to it following that same scope and scheme, but it will be a collaborative effort as it was before.
Okay, I have one more. I didn't see any other hands. The question I have is about the EANS, and it comes out of from the SEA. And so the question being, is there any opportunity to use some of that funding to supply services that are being rendered out of our office?
So yes, as far as the administrative costs, the state of Utah can allocate up to $200,000 of the eligible EANS awards towards the administration of the program. We've discussed that with the governor's office, and they do support us in using some of that funding related to administrative needs. As a part of that, the Utah State Board of Education on Monday of this week, we released a call to the field in terms of seeking a professional service related to this administration. The program itself is only 6 months in terms of the duration of the application cycle and the provisioning of funds. So because it's a time limited specific program, it was, we're doing it through, or attempting to do it through, a professional services agreement as opposed to hiring an employee for such a limited scope.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't see any other hands, so we'll move on. Scott, back to you.
Chair, subject to any other questions or concerns, that concludes agenda item number 7.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Jones.